Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special live episode of SCOTONOMICS, a nice way for us to end the year. We're pleased to welcome Professor Steve Keen. Hello, Steve. How are you doing?
Fine, mate, but I'm travelling far too much for my own good right now. So, yeah, I think I finally moved to the location where jet lag is being extinguished by heading two hours backwards from where I most extended to, which is Vancouver. So I'm now back in Austin, Texas, and I think my brain and my location have caught up with each other.
Oh, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Well, yeah. So you're in the States at the moment, so that's great, and we've got so much to discuss what's going on. I'm sure people already picked up I'm a bit bunged with the cold, so it'll be 98% Steve Keen on this and 2% of me. Steve, what we're going to do this year is just kind of what we're going to do now is just kind of talk about the economic year that we've had. And we're going to do that via a little trip around the globe. As you said, you've been globetrotting Vancouver, Austin the last few days, but we're going to try and cover as much of the globe as we can and talking about the economic year. So let's start with where you are now, not Texas specifically, but America. What has been going on in the American economy the last year? Because it looks very different from a lot of other economies in the world. And also I want to talk to you about the perception in the new administration around debt and deficits and spending and money and waste, all of that. So let's hit the States first, Steve. What's been going on this year?
Well, what we've had under the Biden administration, and that of course coincides with COVID. Well, not with coincide. We had Trump at the end in COVID, and now the Biden administration. We've had 5 years of large government deficits, and that under Biden at the moment, I think the deficit at the moment is down to about 9% of GDP. Now that is what's causing everybody to freak out over here, but it's what caused the bloody growth. And this is again our perspective on modern monetary theory. And it's modern monetary. Let's chuck the T. It's modern monetary fact. Okay? So when the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it creates money. When you give people money, they spend it. Remarkable, but true. And when they spend it, you're going to boost to the economy. So if you look at what's been happening in America versus the rest of the world, except China, you had a high rate of economic growth, because the amount of money creation has meant there's been more spending. The more spending meant more investment, consumption as well. The American economy has done extremely well for the last 5 years, except for the experience of inflation. And that inflation is something that when you look at the data, and that's the best work on that's been done by two good colleagues of mine, Blair Fix, who's the Canadian economist who does brilliant work on economic analysis from a non-standard point of view, and Isabella Weber at the University of Amherst, who first made the case that what's actually causing the inflation is not workers demanding higher wage rises, that has happened under COVID. It's been firms putting up markups. And also it's been the decline in output per head because of the supply disruptions of COVID. So that inflation has been blamed on the increase in government spending. Now, there's an extent to which that's justified, because one of the factors that enables firms to put up markups is the perception that goods are rushing out the door. We can whack up prices without diminishing demand specifically. And if you have a large monetary boost, that's what happens. Firms see that there's large level of money demand around. They think they feel freer to increase markups, so they've done it. And but what people do is this blind association. Increasing money causes increasing inflation. I think of it's a very appropriate place to come with this analogy. I think of the National Rifle Association slogan that guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, my one here is that money doesn't cause inflation, people cause inflation, but money can enable that particular thing to happen. So if you look at the huge monetary boost under COVID, deficits of 20% of GDP, I think roughly, highest outside wartime in human history, certainly in the history of the 20th and 21st centuries. That money boost, if it didn't happen, we would have had financial chaos everywhere. The whole system would have collapsed. but there's no way in which we could calibrate that because we hadn't been through a global pandemic since 1919. How do you know how much you should and shouldn't? What's the perfect? There is no fucking optimal, okay? You do what keeps the system alive. I mean, you look at what was done by the Biden administration, partially by the Trump as well, but mainly by Biden. That level of stimulus prevented complete meltdown. We would have had complete meltdown with the effect of lockdowns, lack of income for people. There would have been, you couldn't pay your rent, landlord couldn't pay the mortgage, a bank couldn't finance yourself, you would have had financial collapse. So we had to have that spending. But yes, it increased the capacity for corporations to put up markups, and we've seen that. I think in that sense, the American economy has performed exceptionally well, but the experience of the inflation is something which, having not had serious inflation for pretty much 30 years, actually even more, like 40 years, that was to the political perception. And then people can say, oh, the Biden administration mishandled things, and look at the level of debt.
So let's I know Karen will want to say hello to our audience and to you now that I've brought her on screen. Just to dig into that a little bit more, Steve, so what you're saying is the perception that the government debt is a bad thing is not backed by any kind of evidence when you look at the success of the American economy. If you're judging the success by the fact that it's growing, it's clearly growing more than almost every other economy apart from China. And you're saying a big part of that is because the government is spending money, and that's helping to grow the economy. And then
sorry. So some people would concede that point and say, but we're going to go bankrupt. You read bloody Musk at the moment. I mean, I'm a fan of Musk and what he's trying to achieve with getting us to Mars, and that won't change. But the bullshit he's spouting, and it's popular bullshit. People think there's actually not bullshit coming out their mouths. They think it's sonorous sounds and wisdom and so on. I'm sorry, their arse and their mouths have been swapped in this experience because what they fear is a crisis which would happen if economic textbooks were correct about how banks work. Now, anybody who knows how wrong economic so therefore they're not wrong. They're worrying about a fantasy. And my little analogy here is that Elon Musk very honestly told people that he used to be afraid of the dark until he realized that the dark was simply an absence of photons in the visible spectrum. Well, it's the same sort of thing. He's afraid of the deficit. But he's afraid of the deficit because he's still thinking in terms of loanable funds, and that's a myth. They're going to get rid of the myth, and the horror of the deficit disappears just like the fear of the dark.
Yeah. Oh, no. Well, let's touch back on that then. I just want to kind of finish with this idea of inflation in the States, because inflation in America wasn't worse than anywhere else. It was just simply that they haven't had much inflation for a few decades. So having some price rises was really kind of was very striking, especially when their wages weren't going up and it looked like there was the kind of cost of living crisis. Now, how do you think that played into the political victory of Trump? So the economy was doing really well. Everyone's talking about 5% growth and how everything's booming, but people were seeing high price rises, and that seemed to have a very different effect than people were expecting in terms of politics. So how did you see that connection?
I think it certainly played a role. It's something which, it's like knee-jerk analysis. Inflation, government, therefore vote for the other side. Okay, but it's also, I think, a more important point to me. I don't think that's as important in practical terms. I think what's actually happened is that we have had 40 years of neoliberalism from the 1980s, actually going on 50 years of neoliberal policy. And the combined effect of that has been to reduce this income, this standard of living of the working poor, the working class. And income distribution has gone massively in favor of the wealthy. So it isn't a cost of living crisis, it's 50 years of a distribution of income crisis. And it finally come to a head now because people's salaries haven't been real salaries in America haven't advanced particularly since 1980. So you've had 40 years plus of experiencing stagnant living standards, but no inflation was taking place. Now you've got stagnant living inflation and inflation is happening. So I think it was a double whammy. The main thing I'd say is actually caused the paranoia is what's happened with the distribution of income, not the recent inflationary episode. You're
okay.
muted.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so final point on the States. Then let's go back to Musk, and you're talking about his understanding or the perception that there's an understanding that he believes in this idea that money's finite and what's used by the government isn't available to the private sector. How do you think that's going to impact the next few years if his belief is an important one for this whole administration? What do you think is going to happen to the US economy? And then finally, I want to know about tariffs, and then we're going to move on to the UK.
Well, the terrifying thing is the government deficit is about $2 trillion right now. It's quite substantial. And that's like about 10% of GDP, or maybe 7 to 10% of GDP. GDP is technically defined in the textbooks he would have written as consumption plus investment plus net government spending plus net exports. Now he's talking about slashing 22 trillion out of GDP to help GDP grow. Or even if just work with a textbook definition, it's an unusual way to grow the economy by slashing it by 10%. So yes, that's the fear that he'll actually do that or enable Trump to do that. It's simply unthinkable. I mean, the amount of discretionary funds, the funds that you can simply turn off if you wish to, is apparently what I've been seeing of the order of 700 billion, not 2 trillion. You're going to get 2 trillion, you've got to slash Social Security, maybe even slash the military. Sorry, I must be stoned. But anyway, there's a possibility. Slash non-discretionary elements of spending. And that would be disastrous because, first of all, you're directly cutting GDP of the order of 7 to 10%. And then you're undermining the physical, the financial and infrastructural supports for so much of business. If let's say they slashed government spending on education, well, there'd be colleges failing all over this country, and sushi shops that weren't selling sushi anymore because the kids couldn't afford sushi, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be a chain reaction, which would be extremely destructive to the American economy. So that's my fear, that they'll actually go in and do that. And that's one reason I'm working on a new book, which is written originally for Rachel Reeves, or for those people who want to attack Rachel Reeves. I don't have any thought that I can persuade her to think otherwise. But that's explaining that if the textbook model of money, which is called loanable funds, is correct, then there is going to be a crisis if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation. But I've built a model of loanable funds in my Ravel software, and within a minute I can convert it across to the real world, which I call bank originated money and debt, or otherwise known as bombed, and the crisis disappears. So that's why I say it's just like the fear of photons thing. If you don't know what causes light, you're terrified by the dark. If you don't know what causes deficits, you're terrified by deficits.
It is that absolute lack of knowledge. I just want to touch on tariffs, and then we'll move over because you've almost segued beautifully into the UK. So if the administration is looking to remove 2 trillion from government spending, it's very, all other things being equal, which we economists say, all other things being equal, GDP will drop because this expenditure will have effectively disappeared. But what role could you see for tariffs? Surely tariffs is going to actually be fantastic, and this will bring everything back. What impact, if we go down this tariff route, will that have on the American economy?
Well, I've got to first I'll point out that America's been deindustrialized under neoliberalism, nowhere near as badly as the UK, let alone as badly as Australia. Okay, but the industrial sophistication of America has declined over the last 30 or 40 years. There's actually a thing called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. And if you look at that, America has gone down in the capacity to use sophisticated goods. And certainly we see now in comparison to China, which has gone dramatically in the opposite direction. So America's been deindustrialized by a period of neoliberal policies, which include free trade. So, the arguments for free trade are the most popular in economics and obviously the most stupid. not the most stupid. I think probably the work on money is worse. But when you look at the theory of comparative advantage, it's a nonsense argument, which even Ricardo knew it was nonsense. Okay, and they've fallen for this nonsense that, you know, cutting trade barriers will boost economic growth by improving specialization. It actually destroys, potentially destroys industries in both countries. And this is what Joe Stiglitz realized when he wrote Globalization and Its Discontents. He saw the practical impact of these policies on countries in Africa and said they're actually being damaged rather than resources moving from protected areas to more efficient areas. The resources just stagnated. And this is what gave us the Rust Belt in America as well. So the Rust Belt is a product of periods of neoliberal deregulation and an emphasis upon free trade. So I'm not at all worried about reversing that. I think that America needs to rebuild its industrial capability, and tariffs can be one way to do that. Michael Hudson's PhD, you know, my great friend Michael Hudson, was called America's Protectionist Takeoff. And doing the type of, you know, very careful historical research he did, he established that a large part of the industrialization of America was under tariffs that meant you couldn't import European iron, so you had to make it yourself. And a huge part, that's part of what Trump is trying to do. So I'm not as angry about that as mainstream economists are. I think it's potentially developing the beginnings of industrial policy for the America, which they need. But I have my doubts about how well organized the American approach will be compared to what the Chinese was.
Yeah, and then obviously that leads back to the issues with inflation. That, you know, there's potential that, you know, there really will be price rises because that any of the imports that are coming in, they're going to be much more expensive, and there's still going to be a demand for all of these things which can't currently be supplied in America. So a really interesting place. A really interesting place.
Yeah. Sorry, I've seen an interesting little comment on Twitter a couple of days ago that some of the Chinese manufacturers are now putting miniature petrol engines in their electric cars because that way they circumvent the controls on exports of electric vehicles. So, you know, it's not given that the prices will rise by as much as the tariffs do, because one thing firms can manipulate is the markup that they put on cost of production. And if they've got a high markup, they might go for a lower markup, still making a profit without the price increase being as big as the tariff increase would make it.
Fantastic. Karen, over to you.
Yeah, I want to bring you back to the UK or to the UK. But first of all, I just want to go over something that you said right at the beginning as well. And just to reiterate for our audience, if we've got anyone new, obviously creating money, it also gives you another option, which is you can save the money. And one of my bugbears is that, you know, that the amount of money that goes to spend on interest in bonds here is considerable. And, you know, to a certain extent, it's social security for the wealthy. But coming back to Rachel Reeves, I just read a headline in this morning's paper is that she's bringing in the bankers to discipline the civil service. So what do you think about that?
I'd rather see them disciplined by the doctors. That'd be much fun. I'd pay money to watch that. Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that even like metaphorically, the idea of bankers having discipline at all is laughable. I mean, I haven't enough time working with people in the finance sector in Australia before I moved to the UK. The only time I saw them disciplined is when they were trying to get their cocaine deal to supply in time for the next party. So there's, you know, it's just, to me, discipline and finance aren't two words I associate with each other, okay, to begin with. But what it means is they're going to go in there and try to manipulate the financial costs or try to reduce the bureaucracy. Now, I'm no critic of reducing bureaucracy. I've had enough experience in working in the public service in Australia and being in education in Australia and the UK to see excessive bureaucracy and, you know, bureaucrats making the rules for the creative people, which is almost always suicidal, rather than assisting the creative people because they're hopeless at admin. They tell the creative people what to do. And that's, you know, I understand the antipathy towards bureaucracy that comes out of that. But the idea that the finance sector has any idea what to do, what they've got to do is stop underfunding health.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
what they have to do, and that's the last thing the bankers are going to recommend.
Yeah. And have you have been observing what's been happening since we've got the new government? Can you share some more thoughts about what's happening as far as the?
To me, it's just a sign of I think Maggie, I think it was Lord Heseltine, but I might have the name wrong. One of Maggie Thatcher's advisors, and that might be quite wrong. So I'm happy to have any conservative history wonks correct me on that front. But
not many watching the show, Steve.
Fair enough. I was maybe watching it, but anyway, this advisor was asked by a journalist, "Will you be happy when a conservative government is in power?" And the answer was no. I'll be happy when there are two conservative parties vying for power. Now, I think Starmer and Reeves are the epitome of that, because they are pushing neoliberalism harder in some ways than the bloody conservatives did. And that's what's so shocking. I mean, I was just flabbergasted when they decided to cancel the winter fuel allowance for pensioners because balancing the budget was more important than people freezing to death. And I just thought you wouldn't be surprised. You'd be cynical, but expect it from the Tories. What the fuck is going on when the Labor Party does it? So to me, it shows the extent to which, except the textbook approach to economics, and it's disastrous both economically and socially.
Yeah, and the difference is huge here. I mean, sometimes you've got a difference between London and the north of Scotland is 17 degrees. That's the difference. So, it does hit Scotland harder, that particular benefit. So the other thing that's happened, or rather that they've chosen to do, is increase national insurance for employers. Now, of course, this doesn't just affect the private sector, it also affects the public sector as well. So we reckon in Aberdeen Council, that's going to cost us about 7.7 million to pay that, bring up that national insurance, because it's not just that we're going to pay more national insurance, the level of where that starts is going to go down. So it's a double whammy in a way.
Oh, I mean, and this is destroying money. You suddenly have less money to put into your local council. And I've got to see if I can find it again, but somebody tweeted out how many libraries have been shut, how many swimming pools have been shut, how many hospitals have been shut, how many homeless shelters, all the things which have been destroyed to try to balance the budget. And you look at it and just think this is catastrophic for the social infrastructure of the UK. So the fact that the Labor Party is doing it just shows how far this disease has gone. And that's why, like, I'm writing it was supposed to be a blog post. It's too damn long. It's now a book. But the title is How Disillusioned Labor Party Supporters Can Fight Back Against Reeves. Because if you've lost the leadership of the party to the stage where you really can't distinguish their policies from the Tories, then, Labor Party members have lost control of a party that used to be about the working class.
Yeah. And I think that's really, really clear. And I think a lot of people are realizing that the difference is, the width of a cigarette paper between Labour and Conservative. I've just got a question.
I love George Galloway's comment. It must be something that's mattered. They're two cheeks of the same bum. So you need toilet paper rather than cigarette paper.
Okay, a comment, I suppose a question actually from Henry here. Is the rumour true that Trump wants to trash the economy so that he can bail it out and all the speculators, kind of in brackets, his friends, I suppose, can cash in?
Now that implies he knows what he's doing. I mean, this is conspiracy theorists grant far too much intelligence to the people they blame conspiracies on. And I've had enough exposure to people in politics. I've met a fair number of MPs in the UK. I've dealt with politicians in Australia. I've had some exposure in Europe as well. I haven't met anybody with spare brain cells in that process. They're clearly all deficient. So you don't get promoted to those positions because you're bright. You get promoted to those positions because you're narcissistic. And the idea that people that narcissistic level of thinking know what they're damn well doing. I'm sorry, they don't. They're dumb. And most of them have swallowed neoclassical economics as well, which is like having a second lobotomy on top of the one you got from being narcissistic. So there's no way that he's planning this. What he may be expecting an instant boom. You know, I think if I
that egotistical aspect of it.
Yeah, he'd be thinking, do the cut spending, and like this is what you see in Reeves' work as well. By the way, she talks about cutting government spending to boost investment. Now it's going to be the opposite. Cutting government spending will reduce investment. So the expectations they've got are the opposite of what's going to happen, and they come out of a flawed theory of economics in particular, but also an aggrandized opinion of their capacity to manage things they don't understand.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add, we're not going to cover Scotland in too much detail tonight, but there was an interview with Ivan McKee, who's our public finance minister, on the BBC earlier, and just at the end of last week after the Scottish budget. Stephen, I'd love you to watch it, but he's there, and there's a Labour politician in the studio in London, and they're saying, well, Scotland have made a decision. They've decided that reducing child poverty is something important. And that's what Scotland should be able to do. That's with devolution, and and they've made their own decisions. And he says, almost quoting here, he says, but in Labour we've made a decision that we need to control the public finances, and this is more important. And he almost says something as clear as removing children from poverty is not as important as keeping control of the public finances. And it just really took me back to kind of 25 years ago and hearing a Conservative minister under Thatcher say that. But this is a Labour, and I apologize, I can't remember if it's a minister or if it's just a member of an MP, but that is what he says, kind of as clear as anything. And for us in Scotland, the difference between the Scottish government saying there's a point, there's a reason for us being in government, and that's to remove child poverty, and then the Labour government saying almost the exact opposite, was just absolutely shocking to see. And my kind of final point on that, Steve, no one really picked that up. No one in the media has run with and said, what a difference. You have a government here and you have a government in London who are completely taking a different approach to the economy. Is this something that you see, kind of, you're looking at this kind of global picture, when good governments do something good, there's never really much coverage of it. It's never really spoken about. But when like a good government does something bad, then everyone knows about it. That's kind of a general kind of comment before we move back to our globetrotting. What do you think?
I think it's true. I mean, and this is because they've all swallowed neoclassical economic theory, whether they've done a degree or not. I mean, Rachel Reeves raves about her having done a economics, a PPE degree. So she did 1 year of economics in PPE, and then she has a master's degree at LSE. She's getting, she's read the textbooks. We know that. A lot of other people they do PPE and that's it. They've got 1 year of neoclassical or micro. If they haven't done it in journalism, effectively, the ideas you learn still come out of neoclassical economics. So in all these cases, they think the most important thing for the government to do is to spend no more than it gets back in taxation. That's number one. So it is. I mean, I've my focus on modeling money came from modeling the credit side of things, and I only since I've invented Ravel have I got into modeling the government side. But it's obvious now the damage that myth does. As Stephanie said, the deficit myth. That false understanding, the false belief the government borrows from the private sector to spend, and therefore has to pay money back to the private sector if it borrows more than if it spends more than it gets back in taxation. That's the road to ruin. That has become so deeply ingrained in people, courtesy of conventional economic theory, that I think is the second most important damage we face. The most important being climate change as well. But of course, when you're doing this, what you're doing, this is something I've got to get again to set my book for. There's a focus on the financial assets to say we must make sure the government is in positive financial equity. Okay? But positive financial equity, as you guys both know, for the government means identical negative financial equity for the private sector. The sum of all equity, financial equity, is zero. But what you should be doing is creating non-financial assets, houses, schools, roads, computer chips as well. It's the private sector too. You want to create these non-financial assets, things which are an asset to the person who owns them and a liability to no one. And instead what we're doing is destroying those non-financial assets. And when you do it, you reduce your productive capacity. You even reduce your capacity to address climate change because you don't have the trained people or the facilities that are necessary to reverse direction. So we are destroying our capacity to create because we don't want to have negative financial equity. It is the nature of a government to have negative financial equity. It's not a bug, it's a feature. So this pernicious myth, I think, is destroying capitalism. And that's the weird thing. People who think they're defending capitalism are actually destroying it.
All right,
so
fantastic.
maybe you could start tell us a little bit about what's happening in Japan, Steve. I noticed that they're changing the interest rates, and also we should maybe also mention that their deficit is currently 250% of their GDP. Is that correct?
Not that the government debt's about 250% of GDP. I actually use Japan as a very interesting comparison to say to what extent did neoclassical economic policies reduce the rate of inflation. Now, neoclassical policy theory, and this is the modern theory, which is even worse than the old theory. The old theory said that you put up the interest rate, you reduce the number of projects, investment projects, which have a net positive present value. So if you increase the rate of interest, you reduce investment. Okay? And that's the idea of the old-fashioned idea. The new-fashioned idea is that you increase the rate of interest, you reduce the level of consumption. They actually, the way that conventional economic models are set up, both real business cycle models and dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, DSGE models, is that consumption is what they call a jump variable. So investment has sort of got a momentum to it and you're locked into the level of investment. But if you change the rate of interest, you change the desirable level of consumption, and consumption jumps, and that's what causes the business cycle. Total lot of bullshit. Okay? Now, the way you can find it out empirically is say, well, which country is most successful at reducing the rate of inflation? The answer is pretty close to being Japan. Now, what did Japan do? It changed its interest rate from minus 0.25% to 0. That's all it did. At the time when America went from about half of 1% to 5.5%. So
and it's had that rate for like what, a couple of decades, isn't it? It's kind of sat at that close to zero for such a long period of time.
Yeah. So they did nothing to the interest rate, and inflation went up and down in China, and it has less inflation in Japan than America, and they recovered faster, and they did nothing. So that shows how effective neoclassical economic theory is.
Yeah, and they are an island, and they're not a huge country like America, so they, I would imagine they would have to import a lot more than America would. So it turns it on its head, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, they're not a big oil producing nation. I don't think they produce much oil at all, or gas. They import all of their.
They've got virtually the energy resources, except for nuclear and solar and hydro, are all imported. So I've never heard. There must be Japanese coal mines, but I've never heard of them. I can tell you where the coal mines are in America and Europe and Australia and England. So in terms of natural resources, they're almost devoid of them. But that's actually been their strength in some ways. So, but they necessarily had to pay increased imported prices for energy inputs, but everything else is manufactured. So the fact that they got more exposed to imported inflation than America or the UK or Europe, and had less inflation, is a sign of they're doing something right. And like one of the things they're doing right is not worrying about deficit, because is that the government deficit in Japan got to its lowest point, and I can't remember. I think it was either 30 or 60% of GDP, and at the end of their bubble economy period, about 1989, and it's since risen to 250% of GDP. Now that has counteracted the impact of a credit collapse in Japan, because they had the very first major credit bubble of the post-war period was Japan, and at one point their private debt level was 225% of GDP, when the government debt was about 1/6 of that. So they haven't reduced the private debt as much as they should have. The private debt is a real worry, but by the government deficit has counteracted the deflationary impact of falling credit. So they're not the best example, but an example the arguments of modern monetary theory, government debt level doesn't matter. It's a record of how much money you've created. It's not borrowing. And so
well, I know what's going to happen with Japan, Steve, and you know this is as soon as the Japanese economy starts doing badly, it maybe take 25 years for this to happen, but it'll all be because of government debt, and MMT, and everyone will say MMT always goes on about how great Japan is and how it's so different, and look what's happened. No matter what causes it, the blame will come to some MMT madness. And we've got a couple of questions and comments, Steve, that I'd love to get to you. So we've got a question from Charles here. Have we ignored Adam Smith's warning? I'll put it up on screen. To not allow individuals to accrue too much wealth, otherwise markets will be distorted to everyone's detriment. What's your thoughts, Steve? And then
we've definitely ignored the distribution of income, and this is actually a product of Smith and Ricardo and Marx and all the classical school economists realized that distribution of income was a question of power, relative power. Okay? Whereas the neoclassical theory said your income reflects the contribution you make to society. It's what they call the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, but it's fundamentally a meritocratic theory. It says you get paid what you contribute. Okay? And that then says, well, inequality is not a bug, it's a feature. Okay? But what Marx and Smith and Ricardo and so said, too much inequality is a real problem, and you don't want your wealthy people to be the non-productive ones. Now, the wealthy people in Ricardo's time were the landlords, and the wealthy people in our time are the financiers. And what we've actually enabled is what Marx brilliantly once called the roving cavaliers of credit to take over the system. So we're completely wrong to ignore the distribution of income. It's the factor which has led to not the only factor, but probably the major factor that led to the sense of crisis and sense of fragility that we have today. So we have to focus back on the level of the distribution of income. And a large part of it, why it's so unfair, is we have too much private debt.
Yeah. And I think that is a really important point because hopefully at the end we'll touch on the ecological crisis. But when we focus on the redistribution, we're not focusing on growing the economy. We're focusing on sharing what we have already. And I think that's a really strong argument, an ecologically sound economic argument. Another reason for us to focus on equality, because we're sharing what we've got already rather than trying to keep growing and growing and growing. And we've got another question here from Lindsay Bruce, the $1 million question, Steve. How do we get politicians to do the right thing instead of what is easy for them to do?
That's bloody hard. And I think I've spent 50 years of my life trying to get politicians to realize that the structure of the economy is almost the opposite of what you get told in an economics textbook. It's economics textbooks, neoclassical theory, that's the ideology which is destroying capitalism while they think they're building it. So I've given up. There's just, you can't get through to them. And there's a range of reasons. Even if they did understand what the actual system was, then they're constrained by the belief of journalists and the opposition side of politics as well, and a lot of the public, that they think, oh, even though I know it, I can't really do it because I'll be trod on. So my feeling is the only way we can actually make a change is for the public, not the politicians, to realize the actual system and then start pushing back, because we've got to expand the window that politicians perceive. Because even though massively egotistical and narcissistic and believe that they, God's gift to the universe, they're afraid of losing the support of the public. So that fear is what partly constrains them to these same old conventional policies all the time. So that's why I'm writing this particular book. The target is, individuals who are themselves as pissed off as you and we all are about the crazy state of politics and the crazy beliefs people have, and willing to go out and harangue their friends in a pub. And that's what I'm writing the book for.
Yeah, fantastic. And we're really grateful for all of the work that you've done for, certainly as long as we've been doing this, but much longer than we've been doing this, for you to bring these things to people's awareness. And, that's one of the motivations for our show as well. Karen, do you want to do another country for Steve?
Oh, yes. What about Argentina?
That's a basket case. I've got my first exposure to what Argentina was like was actually through a French girlfriend of all things back in Sydney. One of her friends was a medium-level diplomat, the Argentinian consulate, and he told me at one point, he said Argentina's foreign debt is about 40 billion at the time. And he said we're almost certain that we could find 40 billion in the offshore accounts of all the Argentinians. So they just realized there was this huge, ripping off the country and putting your money offshore was a huge part of the overall financial straits Argentina found itself in. And then there's a guy, it's Gabriel de Palma, I think, of Gabriel de Palma, who wrote a brilliant profile of the Argentinian economy in a book about a friend of mine, Ted Wilwright. And in that, he said that if you look at the level of consumption, the consumption in America, about 70% you can say is middle class and working class, and 30% the upper class. So if you look into Argentina, it's the other way around. 70% of consumption is the wealthy, 30% is the poor. And partly, he says, the rich Argentinians are trying to keep up with the lifestyle of the rich Americans. So the level of inequality is far, far greater in that country than it is in any other Western, in a typical Western country. And populism has failed to break its back. So you had the Perón period and so on, and they ended up sometimes siding with the oligarchs rather than breaking them down. So that oligarchic nature of Argentina is a major, major problem. And if that situation, you're running a huge trade deficit, which they're running almost all the time, and you then have to borrow in another currency, which they do, and then you've got to actually pay the debt in American dollars. You've got to earn American dollars. So you then have an emphasis on exports and reducing domestic consumption. All this stuff is absolutely disastrous. And I did some figures just recently. I've got to go back and take a look at them again. I took the Bank of International Settlements database. If you know the BIS database, it's an excellent database on levels of debt, both private and public, around the world. And I looked at the rate of change of the debt and called that the deficit. Because it's hard to get comparative figures across 50 or so countries on actual deficits, but you can find change in government debt and then call that the deficit. Pretty accurate. And Argentina's deficit, when I did the calculations, and I've still got to go and check them, I'm just not confident they're right, was over 100% of GDP. Now, there's no MMT person who's going to argue in favor of a deficit of 100% of GDP. Something's seriously wrong, okay? So in that situation, I can understand the appeal of Milei, and I can understand some of the policies. You've got to break the back of that somehow. Whether you'll do it or not is another story. I'm really sort of standing on the sidelines because that is such a basket case to be in that situation. So you have to reduce the rate of inflation. It was running at a couple of 100% per year. And when I did some empirical work on where you would draw the line between inflation and hyperinflation, it seemed to be about 40% rate of inflation. Above 40%, you're in a hyperinflationary environment. Below that, you're in it's high level if you hit 40%, obviously, but it's not runaway stuff. Well, they were in 6 times that level. So it's you can't argue for a measured approach to an economy that's in that state. Now, some of the stuff that Milei is going to do could break the back of that inflation rate. You've got to have production back on shore again. I've noticed actually one thing he's doing, which is a sort of a tax trick that rewards people to repatriate money they've got overseas. So I saw that and thought, aha, this is some of the stuff that I saw from this Argentinian diplomat, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So it's a mess. It's something which has got all sorts of social and historical roots, Argentina used to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So it's had a huge sense of decline as well.
I remember seeing an economist present, Steve, who said there's 3 types of countries. There's developing countries, developed countries, and Argentina. And it was almost to say it's just so unique that trying to kind of compare it to anywhere and trying to get a real understanding of that economy when it's just so complicated and different from everywhere else, it's really, really difficult. So thanks for having a stab at that. I've got an easier one for you. Australia. What's the Australian economy like? And I'd also like very briefly for you to look 10, 15 years ahead and think about the Australian economy. And I want to start bringing in the climate crisis into that as well, if that's not too much to you.
One of my friends in Surrey, his name is David Llewellyn-Jones, but he runs a business called Macro Business. And his byline is houses and holes. He said, that's what Australia is, houses and holes. We build real estate, or we gamble on real estate, and we dig up minerals and flog them overseas to houses and holes. And that really summarizes the state of the economy. And I mean, I'm quite embarrassed to see what's been happening with the Labor Party government there, because it's a piss weak version of Rachel Reeves. They're obsessing about the budget deficit. But you also, I just saw a couple of days ago a tweet from Anthony Albanese, who's the Prime Minister of Australia, Labor Party, and he bragged about the fact that they'd reduced the amount of a deposit that you need to buy a house to 2% of its purchase price, to let people into the market. And I simply couldn't help myself. I tweeted back and said, I can't believe that you're a graduate of the Department of Political Economy at Sydney University that I helped establish. The department would not exist except for the work that I and a large band of fellow activists did in 1973, what's called the Day of Protest over the teaching of economics there. And here's a guy who also, like me, is occupied, I think he's occupied the Vice-Chancellor's office. He certainly climbed on top of the main quadrangle at Sydney University and done this radical stuff. Here he is, 2% deposit. That means you can gear the price. Your gearing ratio for buying a house is 50 to 1. That's making things better. In the old days, back when my father was a bank manager, the maximum gearing gear was 3 to 1. The amount of money you had would be tripled in the money you'd get to buy a house. Now the amount of money you have 50 times. It is simply the whole focus on government policy in Australia is to maintain the housing bubble. So that side of the place horrifies me. They've also, this is the leading into the climate thing, they sort of put themselves across as being concerned about climate. Tanya Plebiscik, who is a person I know and I like as a person, she actually was the person who launched Debunking Economics when it was the very first edition back in 2001. And she'd clearly read it, or she'd scanned bloody well when she read the speech for it.
Can you just tell us who that is? I don't think our audience will know who that is.
Tanya Plebiscik is one of the leading women members of the Labor Party. She's not Deputy Prime Minister, but she's about that rank. She's Minister for Education, Minister for Climate Change, I think. And she's, in training climate change, she's been approving coal mines and oil fields and fracking and you name it. So they're trying to address climate change by causing more of it. So I'm incredibly disappointed by the Labor Party in Australia. And the economy itself, in terms of growth, which is, of course, the only thing they're trying to achieve is economic growth. In per capita terms, Australia's income has been falling for the last 4 or 5 years. So they're maintaining migrant inflow so they can show growing GDP from population growth alone. But in terms of actually developing a more sophisticated economy, we're going backwards. So, you know, I find the Australian political scene incredibly disappointing. And we're going to get a meathead, a meathead conservative winning election the next time round. And this is what I find horrifying. Labor parties have been fooled to believe they've got to be good economic managers. They then swallow economic textbooks and impose those policies on the public. And what they are, the Conservatives implement economic textbook policies and brag about it. The Labor Party implements and apologises for them. They have the same bloody effect. And after one term in office, the Labor parties get thrown out and the Conservatives take over again. So so it's quite likely that the Labor Party, pardon me, will be a one-term government.
Yeah, and that's likely to happen in the UK as well. Steve, have you got a glass of water or something there you want to just quickly?
We've
only got 10 minutes left, so we'll let you do that.
I'll rush over quickly.
You got to look after your guests, Karen. You can't have them coughing away in the background, can you?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So
where are you going next?
Oh,
Right.
no.
My host here has soda water everywhere. I think I got the soda water and I opened the beer. There you go. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to move up the globe, and I'm quite interested to know what you to know what you think about the Nordics and the Nordic economies, and then maybe moving down into Europe after that as well.
The Nordic economies, I mean, Norway in particular has been dominated by its oil fund. It's been quite successful in industrializing itself. You look at Norway at the end of the Second World War, it was a peasant economy. Now it's a highly advanced industrial economy. But they've also got a housing bubble going crazy. They fund their failures to create sufficient government money by taking money out of the oil fund they've generated, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. Sweden seems to be going anti-social democratic. Sweden is the country that invented the Nobel Prize in economics, pardon me, and that's the whole idea of that prize was to attack social democratic policies, which were strong in Sweden at the time, and push to market-oriented policies. It's been quite successful, and Sweden seems to be making that switch as well. And again, attitudes against migrants are also playing a major role in a lot of those economies. So, I mean, I still think those are wonderful countries to live in. If I hadn't had a choice, however, where to live, then living aside climate, that part of the world, and I'm living in Amsterdam now, which is close, that the quality of the social infrastructure is great. A lot of that's because of running trade surpluses. Those trade surpluses are made up for low levels of government spending. So they've got social infrastructure, welfare systems, which are far better than the UK. And I like living in that part of the world. The infrastructure is higher quality. Trains you can actually ride on rather than ones that should be in museums. A lot of national ownership as well. So I'm strongly favourably disposed towards the Nordic countries. But again, they're dominated by conventional economic thinking. So those days may be numbered.
Yeah, I'd just like to chip in something before we go to continental Europe, Steve. Is it in Scotland, our politicians always talk about how we want to be Nordic nations, and it's a real kind of aspiration to run our economies like the Nordics. And when Kieran and I introduced the minister who's in charge of climate at SCOTONOMICS the year you were there, we said to her, you do realise that these countries, have their Earth Overshoot Day in April, and that they're consuming 3 times their resources that would be allocated to them if we were to keep within planetary boundaries. And it was just this complete lack of, they're really sustainable countries. No, they're not sustainable. They're huge resource consumption economies and countries. And I agree with you, wonderful place, but still hugely resource consume so much resource, and we really do need to think about who do we aspire to when we're looking at
Finland.
countries.
Finland is a better example on that front. Finland has been much more national in its over. I don't think it's got anywhere near the level of. I don't know if it has fossil fuel. I'm actually literally do not know, but I think Finland is a better example than any of the other countries in terms of maintaining a social cohesion and industrializing well and being prepared for what might come our way.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Will we head over to Europe? What's your thoughts on Europe, Stephen? Then I want to finish with just a very kind of brief China and Russia, and then we'll let you go.
Well, Europe, I mean, the fun thing at the moment is watching Germany, because Germany has been the country which gave us the Maastricht Treaty and really gave us the ordo-liberal focus on reducing government spending. That's still that's now coming home to roost. And when they lost access to Russian energy, a bunch of conservative German economists argued that losing even 10% of a 10% increase in the cost of energy would only cause a 0.4% fall in German GDP. Well, good luck with that. The German economy is suffering really badly, and they're now seriously discussing getting rid of what they call the debt brake. So that's a country that really has institutionalized austerity and anti-government spending globally, and they're now suffering from it very badly. So it's sort of fun to watch there and imagine what might happen as that debate goes on. But they called the Maastricht Treaty the Growth and Stability Pact. It's been the Stagnation and Instability Pact. And I think that's finally starting to dawn on a lot of people, particularly in Germany. France also to some extent. And we're seeing all these pressures about the emphasis on reducing government spending, reducing government debt. There's some pushback now finally happening inside the EU. So as bad as it is, there's a sort of a harbinger of change there.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. I think when you look at the report that was, I think it was a Draghi report that came out just a few months ago, and it was suggesting that, the reason that we're behind America is because of productivity issues, and it's really clear. And I think a lot of people in Europe are saying, no, the reason is that we are forcing austerity, not spending, not building an infrastructure in the way that Europe needs to. Okay, let's go China and then Russia, Steve.
Well, the Chinese economy is if growth is your focus and technological development is your desire, then China is the outstanding country of the last 50 years. No two ways about it. I was in China in 81, 82, and I went walking along Shanghai, on the main street of Shanghai. On the other side of the Bund River, there were rice fields. You go there now, there's this technological marvel. All the cities that are they built, the quality of the infrastructure in China is stunning. And I've had a Chinese girlfriend for a while. I spent some time in her place in Dayang, which is a small city, a mere 4 million people. And I got, living with she was actually a public relations person for the nuclear fusion project in France. So her friends were fairly intelligent, fairly well off. But I played tennis with people in the city. I caught buses and trams around. I got a feeling what it was like in a medium to small Chinese city for the average citizen. And I reckon they're as well off as anybody in England, if not better. So the standard of living is dramatic. And we went to a couple of, another time I was in China, we went to giving seminars at a university just north of North Korea, and went to these huge line dancing parties which occur in China, the sort of thing that's very much Chinese culture. And I saw an old woman there dancing away in the line, and she was certainly like older than me. She would have experienced 20 years of Mao or 30 years of Mao. Yeah. And to see, and the difference in what she's having as a lifestyle in old age versus what she would have as a child is just quite stunning. So China has focused upon China's been more successful in raising the standard of living of its people than any country on the planet. So I hear people putting down China, saying it's authoritarian, yada, yada, yada. Yes, that's true. But those authoritarians take no notice of what the poor want than the democratic people in the Western countries. The democratic people in the Western countries follow what the finance sector wants. And the one reason for this is the Chinese have seen Chinese people riot. You don't want to be there when that happens. So a lot of whenever there's a failure in the particular policy under the Mao days, the Communist Party days, there'd be a revolt, and that would flip the power system at the top of the Communist Party, which would continue equally doing another crazy policy, a lot of it related to whether you grew wheat, protein crops or carbohydrate crops. That was the major political debate in the Communist Party at the time. But they experienced plenty of peasant revolts. And therefore, there's a focus. We've got to make sure people feel like they're giving a better life. And that's still the focus of China. And they focus on building things. The rather than like left versus right ideological battles, which is what we now see very right versus slightly right ideological battles in the West. That's what we're watching. But the Chinese, bugger their battle. What sort of engineering should we have? How should we build the bridges? Where do we want to build the infrastructure? So that focus. And then the government money creation level, as I said, the second highest level of deficit, maybe in the top 5, was China at about 9% of GDP. But that 9% of GDP is going to build roads, not just roads, rail, high-speed rail, technological advances that are embarrassing when you compare it to what the West is doing. So that still is they get together to cooperate to govern. We get together to bicker and govern, and we bicker over whether the deficit, whether we should reduce the deficit by 1 or 2% of GDP. That's the state of politics in the West. The Chinese, it's about how do we build the place, and equally we're preparing for climate change in a way far beyond anything that's being done in the West. The level of the world's largest solar factories are in China. The largest nuclear program is in China. So all these things mean if any countries on a grand scale is going to be prepared for what's coming our way, it's China, not the West. So for all the criticisms I think of their political system, I think when you measure in terms of performance, they're the best on the planet.
Fantastic, and I thoroughly recommend the book Shock Therapy by Weber, Professor Weber. How China escaped shock therapy, which is a fascinating read, a real deep dive into the
I haven't read that.
Culture. Yeah, it's fantastic.
I need some time for reading. Yeah, I'd love to read it if I get a chance.
It's fantastic. Okay, last country then, Steve. I think we wanted to, unless you've got anyone for Steve before you discuss, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on Russia and the huge impact and the change that's happened since the invasion of Ukraine.
I mean, to me, like I know enough of the history of Russia to be aware that the provocation that led to the war came from the West. Okay? So, but I know enough of the history of Russia as well to be very afraid of what happens when Russian particular political decision is taken in Russia. So, without a doubt, NATO provoked the invasion of Ukraine by expanding NATO into Russian territory. I think at one stage Putin actually asked to apply to join NATO and was refused. That should have been accepted. And people don't realise that the reason Putin came to power was because the West pretty much installed Yeltsin, who was a drunken and idiot, because he was easily malleable, and the country was falling apart. It was falling apart because the Russians adopted shock therapy. They did what the American economists told them to do, which is to rapidly transit from the social system to the capitalist system. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs was involved in that, but he's redeemed himself dramatically over how he's changed since those days. But if you want to see a piece of absolute stupidity, find a paper by a guy called Murray Wolfson, Wolfsen, where he talks about how logic led to the conclusion that the only way to do the transition was overnight, because you work back logically and saying the prices will change at some time in the future, so people won't spend. So you come back and say, it just shows that you should go instantly to the market system in one day. What fucking market system? You know, the political system in Russia, you had, of course, central planning. Central planning meant that you never had quite enough resources for any of your industries. So if you wanted to reach the plan, you had to have a mafia deal to make sure you got some of the stuff that fell off the back of a truck for supplies. So when you deregulated like that, the mafia was the group that took over. And then Putin came to power because he suppressed the mafia. And I just think of his name right now. It's a great historian, does historical modeling. I'm trying to think of his name right now. I can't drag it out. He argued that what he experienced as a child was you're at the stall somewhere and the mafia would turn up and demand money from the stall people right in front of you. So it was quite a terrifying. Peter Turchin, Peter Turchin. He said then when Putin came to power, he wiped out the low-level mafia and sort of integrated the mafia with the government. Now, what it meant was, yes, there's still oligarchs screaming off the top of the country, but they're not screaming off in front of you. You're not facing being shot if you don't hand over the proceeds from your stall for that day. So that's a major reason why Putin was respected. But he also did it in a very brutal way. He wiped out the Chechen rebellion and just did to the Chechen what Israel's doing to Gaza right now. So there was brutality in putting down the protest. And then, of course, that's part of what's happened with Ukraine as well. I was quite expecting Putin to invade the Donbass and take over that region, saying, you're not going to give us a buffer state, we're going to take the buffer state. Trying to invade Ukraine and suppress it entirely, I thought was just crazy overstep. And that you can see to some extent to which there's like an echo chamber in the Kremlin telling him it'll happen, you'll be welcomed as liberators. Well, 3 days after the invasion, they were being having their butt kicked by the Ukrainian forces. They didn't expect that. It's now been going on for 2 bloody years. And we've got two of the world's major grain baskets fighting each other. When if we actually have a collapse in grain, then the globe is going to suffer from that. It's not just going to be Ukraine or Russia that suffers. So I want to see a resolution to that. You have to concede part of Ukraine to the Russians, and then get an agreement to neutrality for Ukraine, not joining NATO, get a buffer state of neutral states bordering Russia and Europe, because again, things like the Holodomor have given the Ukrainians an absolute reason to not want to be integrated entirely into Russia. The Finnish themselves, that's one reason they're so successful socially. They fought off the Russians during and after the Second World War. There's a reason for a buffer between those two regions of the world, and we need one. Neutral countries between the two. And so, yeah, it's a mess.
Well, we went off the economy there, and my point is
the Russian economy,
the one of the really interesting things within Isabella Weber's book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, is the comparison with what happened to Russia in the 19th, and that's what makes it so incredibly interesting, is how those two, at the time, fairly similar economies completely changed, and how one, is in the position it's in now. It's fascinating, Steve. That's almost as fascinating as your trip taking us around the world. We've had you for over an hour, and as one of our guests said, one of our attendees said, we do feel really lucky to call on you a couple of times as we do.
I appreciate the invitation, guys. I really do. So thank you.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you to you as well.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it. We'll see you at some point next year. Enjoy the rest of your time in the States, and we'll see you soon.
Will do.
Bye for now.
Bye.
And don't freeze to death in Scotland, please.
See you later.
See you later.
Oh, he's gone.
Well, that was lovely, wasn't it? An opportunity to say thanks, and for him to say something back. That was great. Yeah, a real tour de force as always. I know I was thinking, was there anywhere I did want to cover? It'd be nice to hear a little bit more what's happening in the Russian economy, because I am really keen to see what's been happening there since the invasion. I think I'll actually do some of my own reading into that. Anywhere else you wish we would have gone?
Oh no, I think we covered everything I wanted to cover. So no, that was good. It was excellent. Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everyone for joining us live. It's great to have your comments and questions when we've got a live guest on. Next week, we've got a really interesting interview with someone from the Scottish Land Commission, talking about capital markets and also land reform, which is going to be a really big topic for us next year. So join us for the last episode of the year. Thanks so much for joining us this evening, and we'll see you all hopefully next week, if not soon. Bye for now.
Good night.